Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicole from the Institute of Banking and Finance, and I'm delighted that you are able to join us for this IBF Masterclass, jointly organized with Herbert Smith Freehills Prolegis, where we will look at MES guidelines on individual accountability and conduct in financial institutions. Ms. Natalie Curtis, partner at Herbert Smith Freehills, and Ms. Sandra Sao, director at Prolegis, will be leading today's session with our group of panelists. Before I invite Natalie and Sandra to take the lead in today's session, allow me to do a very brief intro on the IBF and the resources we have to help professionals in the financial industry. The Institute of Banking and Finance was established by the MES in 1974 as a training provider to provide functional training for the financial industry. Since then, our role has evolved into one of standard setting for financial services sector skills and competencies. Since August 2018, we also expanded our mandate to cover career advisory and job matching function for the financial services sector. We have thus adopted an integrated approach to skills development and jobs for the financial services sector. Here's a quick look at our services and how we support the industry across training, recruitment, and workforce transformation. You can find out more about our services and connect with us in any of these areas via our website. In light of MES's recent announcement in June, IBF will also be extending training support measures to foster skills development. Then the enhanced course fee subsidies are part of MES's support package that was announced in April last year to sustain and strengthen capabilities in the Singapore financial services and fintech sectors amid the current economic downturn. The course fee subsidies under both IBF Standards Training Scheme and Financial Training Scheme will be extended till 30th June 2022, with 80% of course fees subsidized. To help mature workers acquire industry-relevant skills as the industry transforms, Singapore citizens aged 40 and above will continue to receive the enhanced subsidy at 90% from 1st January 2022 under training under IBF STS and FTS. The training allowance grant will also be extended for employees sponsored by eligible financial institutions and fintech firms till 30th June 2022 at a rate of $10 per training hour. For more details, you may head to the IBF website. In addition, IBF will also be supplementing the commercial training available with free webinars during this period to support the training needs of the industry. Financial professionals can also tap on the Learn in IBF mobile learning app for bite-sized learning at your own leisure. All these complimentary training are accorded with CPD hours. And that concludes my short intro. I'm going to hand the time over to Natalie and Sandra.
Great, thanks, Nicole. I'm just going to share my slides, so bear with me for one moment. Can I just check that you can see my slides on the screen there, Nicole?
Yes, I can see.
Great, thanks. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natalie Curtis. I'm a partner at Herbert Smith Freehills. I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleague Sandra Sao, who's a director of Prolegis LLC, who is our formal law alliance firm here in Singapore. We're going to do a quick presentation on the IAC guidelines, followed no doubt by what you will all be wanting attending for, will be our panel discussion with our distinguished guests. We'll also allow for some time for Q&A, so please do use the chat function should you wish to raise any questions for the panel to consider later on in the presentation. So with that, I will move through to take a quick look at the agenda. So we're going to provide a brief overview of the IAC guidelines. They obviously come into effect on the 10th of September, so no doubt many of you will be in the midst of implementing them now. We'll have a look at the role of senior managers and the role of material risk personnel. Obviously, they are the very sort of key tenets of the regime. But of course, MAS does go further and expects, the standards of conduct, which, we expect to see from all employees to be promoted and embedded more broadly. We'll have a quick look at accountability, and then we'll run through some best practices. As I mentioned, we've got the panel discussion, and then we'll have some Q&A. So with that, look, I mean, just to take a step back, and I think it's always a good reminder to sort of understand how we have gotten to where we are today. And really, I mean, we've seen, you know, a number of senior manager regimes now rolled out in various jurisdictions. And I think the genesis of them was sort of largely the fallout from the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. And of course, significant conduct failings that we've seen since then. So, you know, manipulation of interest rate benchmarks is something that comes to mind. And I think the concern really was a lack of enforcement or disciplinary action taken against individuals in light of such, you know, misconduct or systemic failings in the industry. And so there was a recognition that, you know, sort of waving the big stick at you know, financial institutions and imposing sanctions only went so far. And really what we needed were regulatory regimes aimed at sort of influencing behaviour in order to mitigate misconduct risk, and also to increase transparency and individual accountability across the financial services industry more broadly. So as I mentioned, prior to the IAC guidelines, we saw the UK come up with their senior manager and certification regime. It's quite a prescriptive regime, very wide-reaching now that it's been expanded to most of the financial services industry in the UK. Of course, then we saw Hong Kong follow with the SFC's manager in charge regime, and soon after the HKMA with the Registered Institutions Senior Management Accountability regime. Now, they really focused on, in Hong Kong, sort of identifying those senior managers and less sort of around the conduct aspects, and that was rolled out through, for example, the HKMA's sort of focus on culture, and that through other regimes. And then, of course, we've had Australia with the Banking Executive Accountability Regime, probably the best acronym, BEAR, although that is to be replaced or supplemented somewhat by the Financial Accountability Regime, which we expect will come out. We'll see some detail on that sort of later this year. And then, of course, MAS's guidelines on individual accountability and conduct, and not to forget rather, in this region as well, Malaysia also, Bank Negara has been looking at a responsibility mapping framework. It's been a long time in the making, but we should expect to see something definitive on that soon. So the Financial Stability Board, which encourages national authorities to develop and monitor a responsibility and accounting framework in its toolkit that it issued for strengthening governance frameworks and mitigate misconduct risks, has said that insisting on clarity in individual responsibilities reflects the priority that the firm places on a culture of good conduct and the need for accountability. By contrast, a lack of clarity in individual responsibilities can make it difficult to hold individuals accountable for their actions and decisions, as well as for reasonably managing the actions and behaviours of those in their area of responsibilities. Looking at the approach taken by MAS, and as I mentioned, you know, the guidelines do come into effect on the 10th of September. So, you know, no doubt, as you're all in the midst of busily implementing them. But Sandra, could you remind us the approach that have taken by MAS in relation to the IAC guidelines, and what exactly are financial institutions expected to achieve?
Well, thanks for the introduction, Natalie. MAS has actually adopted an outcomes-based approach, which identifies 5 accountability and conduct outcomes that FIs are expected to work towards. These are what we have set out in the slide. These 5 outcomes and specific guidance underpinning each outcome are, as set out in the IAC guidelines, aim to reinforce FIs' responsibilities in 3 areas. Firstly, to promote individual accountability of senior managers. Secondly, strengthen oversight over material risk personnel. These are individuals with the authority to make decisions or conduct activities that can significantly impact the FI's safety and soundness, or cause harm to a significant segment of the FI's customers or other stakeholders. And finally, reinforce standards of conduct among employees. The IAC guidelines actually apply to almost all FIs regulated by MAS. FIs with a headcount of fewer than 50 are expected to achieve the 5 outcomes, but will not ordinarily be expected to adopt the specific guidelines described in the IAC guidelines or the specific guidance described in the IAC guidelines. FIs with larger number of employees also have the flexibility not to adopt specific guidance they have assessed to be irrelevant to their businesses. However, FIs that choose not to adopt the specific guidance should be prepared to justify their decision and demonstrate how they achieve the relevant outcome through other means. The outcomes-based approach is intended to facilitate FI's implementation of the IAC guidelines in a proportionate manner as relevant to the nature, size, and complexity of their operations. The IAC guidelines themselves do not replace or override any existing law and regulations. So if the MAS finds that the FI's implementation of the outcomes is unsatisfactory, MAS may require the FI to implement additional measures to address the deficiencies. If FIs and their board and senior management demonstrate an inability or unwillingness to take remedial actions, MAS will take appropriate supervisory actions depending on the severity and potential impact of the weaknesses uncovered.
Thanks, Sandra. So MAS has said that embedding a strong culture of responsibility and ethical behaviour in FIs requires individual accountability on the part of senior managers and a supportive governance framework. Sandra, can you remind us who senior managers are?
Yes, sure. Senior managers are defined in the IAC guidelines as being individuals who are employed by or acting for or by arrangement with the FI and are principally responsible for the day-to-day management of the FI. So certain key principles to bear in mind include, number one, the senior managers should be principally responsible for functions that are core to the business activities of the FI, including what MAS refers to as core management functions. Examples of functions that are likely to be core management functions are set out in Annex B to the IAC guidelines. This list is not exhaustive, and the FIs need to ensure that all material aspects of their operations, not just the core management functions, are subject to appropriate management oversight. Various measures can be used to identify which functions are material. For example, relative size of functions in terms of employees, asset, profit, capital contributions, versus other functions. Identification of senior managers should reflect actual oversight responsibilities and decision-making authority, regardless of his or her physical location. So this means that senior managers may actually be based outside of Singapore. Senior managers should generally have a direct reporting line to the CEO or equivalent, for example, the country head, and where relevant to the performance of that function, to the board or head office as appropriate. So in the case of an FI that's incorporated or established outside of Singapore, well, the board may actually be referring to a governing body or committee beyond local management that's charged with oversight and supervision responsibilities for the FI's operations in Singapore.
Thanks, Sandra. I mean, based on experience in implementing senior manager accountability regimes in other jurisdictions, I mean, some of the other indicators that might also be helpful in determining whether or not somebody is principally responsible for a function can include things like whether that person has sufficient authority to exert a significant amount of influence on the conduct of the function in Singapore, whether that person has authority to make decisions, so such as assuming business risk or setting parameters or relevant limits for the function in Singapore. Also, whether the person has authority to allocate resources or incur expenditure in connection with that particular function. And also, who is the person that is representing the function at, senior management meetings or meetings with outside parties. it's important to remember that while job titles can be helpful, they're also not necessarily determinative. And of course, the IAC guidelines require the senior managers to be fit and proper for their roles, which is something that we see in most of the other regimes as well. So of course, in practice, that means extending your, your current fitness and propriety assessment arrangements and governance around that to make sure that you're rolling out those assessments to now what will be a broader set of employees that are caught. So we'll move on to material risk personnel. I'll move the slide there. So Sandra, the IAC guidelines require that material risk personnel are fit and proper for their roles and subject to effective risk governance and appropriate incentive structures and standards of conduct. Can you tell us just who are these material risk personnel?
Well, MAS has adopted a principle-based definition whereby MRPs are defined as individuals with the authority to make decisions or conduct activities that can significantly impact the FI's safety and soundness or cause harm to a significant segment of the FI's customers or other stakeholders. MAS itself has clarified that it is the individual rather than the functional units that forms the basis for identifying personnel in material risk functions. So MRPs will include front, middle, and back office functions as applicable to the FIs, as well as any other employee with supervisory capacity over such functions. So given the nature of their roles, MAS considers it appropriate for FIs to subject such personnel to more stringent oversight, higher conduct standards than employees in non-MRPs. MAS will also require them to be fit and proper. The identification of MRPs is built on two primary considerations. First is the risk which the FI is exposed to due to the nature, size, and complexity of its business, and the individuals who have the authority to make decisions or conduct activities that could materially impact this risk profile, regardless of whether they are physically based in Singapore or overseas. Accordingly, in identifying MRPs, the board and senior management of the FIs should establish criteria that consider a few things. Whether or not the financial and non-risk functions which the FI is or may be exposed to, including but not limited to credit, market, liquidity, operational, technology, conduct, money laundering, and terrorist financing. So this is your MLTF type considerations, legal, regulatory, reputational, and strategic risks. And also consider at the same time the materiality of the impact that individuals' decisions or activities could have on this risk profile based on the appropriate quantitative and qualitative indicators.
Thanks, Sandra. So it's clear that these, MRPs are really critical to the sort of integrity of the, the organisation. So I think just another thing to remind, I guess, persons, who are MRPs and I guess employees sort of more broadly, and that is that, to the extent that they report to a senior manager, obviously senior managers now are expected to be held accountable for, the conduct of the business under their purview and also the employees and that they oversee. And so I think in order to ensure that senior managers are supported in that role, and to help them discharge their duties and obligations, MRPs, given the nature of their role, it would be good if they obviously escalate matters appropriately, provide relevant and timely updates in relation to the goings on in their function, reporting potential or actual breaches of internal policies and applicable laws and regulations ASAP, attending training, whether it's skills training or soft skills training. And of course, there is an expectation that MRPs will be subjected to higher standards of conduct than other employees. So we'll move on and have a look at accountability. Move the slides there. So as mentioned, the IAC guidelines require financial institutions to put in place measures to promote individual accountability of senior managers and reinforce standards of proper conduct among all employees. As such, the onus is on FIs to ensure that an appropriate consequence management system, including transparent investigation disciplinary procedures, is in place to ensure accountability and enforce the expected standards of conduct. So MAS has not mandated sort of particular actions that may be taken, but unlike some of the other regimes which required variable remuneration and that to be withheld. But of course, as an organisation and considering how you will implement the IAC guidelines, some of the examples of disciplinary action that you might take include looking at remuneration review outcomes, freezing them pending the outcome of any investigation, ineligibility for either an increase, a fixed increase or variable remuneration, or even a downward adjustment. You could have warning letters that could limit, or remove privileges, a reduction in a performance rating, impact on possible promotion and bonus. You might impose additional training or oversight requirements, and of course, you may end up needing to suspend or terminate the employment of an individual. But Sandra, I understand that the IAC guidelines are intended to supplement the existing framework, focusing particularly on the measures that FI should put in place to promote ethical behaviour, responsible risk-taking, and strengthen the accountability of senior managers for the actions of their staff and conduct of the business under their purview. Now, we know MAS has an extensive enforcement toolkit that it can turn to when there is misconduct. Can you remind us what some of those enforcement powers are?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Natalie, it's actually quite varied and quite broad. So, for example, if there's misconduct involving a senior manager, right, MAS will take enforcement action under its existing enforcement powers, such as number one, issuing warning or reprimand letters, or imposing supervisory conditions, directing an FI to remove its director or executive officer, issuing a prohibition order which effectively bans this individual from the financial services industry for a period of time or even permanently. And finally, referring cases to the AGC or Attorney General's chambers for criminal prosecutions. In its enforcement toolkit, MAS could also take enforcement action against the directors or executive officers personally for failing to take reasonable steps to ensure and secure compliance by the FI with any provision of the relevant acts. For example, the Banking Act, the Securities and Futures Act, the Financial Advisors Act. Any person guilty of such an offence should also be liable on conviction to a fine or imprisonment. Enforcement action could actually be taken against the directors or executive officers of the FI personally, where there's an offence under the relevant acts committed by the FI is proved to have been committed with the consent or connivance of, or to be attributed to the neglect on the part of the directors or executive officers of the FI. So in such cases, so you're looking at both the FIs and the directors or executive officers being guilty of that particular offence.
Thanks, Sandra. I think with all of these regimes across the various jurisdictions, obviously, one of the aims is to increase the transparency. So there's a lot more transparency in relation to, whose role it might have been to take those reasonable steps to, secure compliance of the FI with the relevant provisions of those acts that you mentioned. So effectively, it sort of provides a roadmap for MAS to come in and have a better understanding of who's responsible for what. But I think we just shouldn't lose sight of, obviously, there's MAS's enforcement powers, but this regime and these, the regimes across the various industries are really focused on, firstly, changing, people's behaviour, so mitigating, potential misconduct. And then secondly, that the financial institutions will deal with it. You won't, it won't be sort of swept under the rug. Or even as we've got some lovely apples on the slide there, you won't end up in this situation with rolling bad apples, which is another thing that, the MAS is looking to take action against. So, I mean, rolling bad apples was something that was also mentioned in the Financial Stability Board's toolkit for strengthening governance frameworks to mitigate misconduct risk. So stopping those individuals who engage in misconduct in one firm and then move on to another firm without disclosing that earlier misconduct to their new employer. So MAS is obviously active in looking at this. Sandra, can you just quickly run through some of the developments of the consultation?
There are a few things MAS is actually looking at. Well, the first one is MAS is actually consulting on provisions under an Omnibus Act that will give MAS expanded powers to issue a prohibition order against any person who's not fit and proper to engage in regulated activities and identified roles and functions across the financial industry. So MAS has stated that in order to protect FIs and the wider financial industry, it needs to be able to keep out persons who have demonstrated by their misconduct that they have the potential to cause harm. MAS has also proposed to mandate reference checks for individuals to be employed by MAS regulated FIs as senior managers, among other roles. So under this regime, if a senior manager at an MAS regulated FI were to seek employment at another MAS regulated FI, the first FI would be obliged to provide a detailed reference regarding the senior manager to the other FI. The reference will need to cover the past 5 years and include mandatory information such as the senior manager's employment history of the FI, including the reason for cessation of employment, compliance records relating to the senior manager's fitness and propriety, including whether the senior manager has been the subject of any investigations, had disciplinary action taken against them, or misconduct reports filed with MAS against them. And finally, their last 4 balanced scorecard grades. MAS has also recently published a consultation paper on proposed amendments to its investigative and other powers under various acts. So you're looking at this consultation seeking views on proposals to strengthen MAS's investigative powers, to enhance its ability to gather evidence, to clarify that MAS may reprimand a person for misconduct even after the person has left a financial institution or the financial industry. And finally, to introduce powers to enable MAS to impose requirements on certain FIs to manage risks arising from the conduct of unregulated businesses.
Thanks, Sandra. So we'll just move through some run through some best practices now for strengthening accountability and conduct standards. So it's important to foster a culture of risk management and compliance. And really in this, what we mean is sort of discouraging an attitude of compliance just because it's required, and rather ensuring that there's responsibility to comply with regulation, or the responsibility to comply with regulation is taken seriously and actively supported across the organisation. So steps which senior managers may wish to consider to drive culture and compliance, a culture of compliance, include understanding the current culture of the organisation and identifying areas where fostering a culture of risk management and compliance should become a priority. So this would include looking at front office staff, not just control functions such as compliance. Also providing senior leaders with the support that they need to embed cultural change within the organisation. So this would include, providing briefings and materials that they can use for training and communication with their teams. You might consider conducting a regular culture survey to understand the changes that have been put in place and to demonstrate that a culture of risk management has been implemented. Also, senior managers who have been in their role for some time are quite likely to be able to evidence that they already have these sorts of measures in place. But really, for those managers that are coming into a senior manager function, it's important that they come in and try and understand the existing delegation and controls and culture. And so in this regard, an assessment could be conducted on each of these areas to document the existing measures in place and to identify any gaps that should be addressed. Of course, having robust governance controls in place is important, and particularly around delegation. And so by that, you'll need to consider, having processes and controls in place to ensure that where you have delegated responsibilities, that you maintain, proper oversight. So you want to have, regular meetings with employees to which you've delegated any responsibility. Of course, regular reporting, whether on a weekly, monthly, or quarterly basis, on the status of the responsibilities that have been delegated, and whether to identify whether there's any risks or issues that have arisen. Convening committees for specific groups to discuss the responsibility area as well can be helpful. Now, in other jurisdictions in the senior manager accountability regimes, there's been a focus on reasonable steps. Now, I think Sandra identified that within Singapore, there is already legislation which can mean that a senior manager could be personally liable if reasonable steps weren't taken by that person to prevent a breach by the FI. So some of the reasonable steps in that you might take as a senior manager to demonstrate that you are sort of fulfilling your duties is taking things like taking preemptive steps to prevent a breach occurring, ensuring that their policies and controls are implemented and are reviewed regularly, ensuring that there are investigations or at least sort of regular reviews in relation to your area of responsibility, particularly in response to any breach or issues that are escalated to you. Of course, important to ensure that the control around your controls and around your daily operations and delegations are managed and reviewed. And it's really important that you obtain appropriate management information. Moving on to the final slide, so we can get on to our panel discussion. So again, sort of some further best practices in that as well. So recording important, key decisions. So, it's helpful for senior managers to ensure that there's written records of all key internal meetings or discussions, so that the senior manager is then capable of demonstrating with those written records the steps that they've taken to discharge their regulatory responsibilities in relation to their core management function. Now, of course, the degree of formality of records will vary depending on the nature of the steps taken or the decisions made. So formal meetings should ideally be minuted, but actions following a discussion with a direct report, it might be just appropriate to follow up with an email. So ideally, records would capture all decisions of consequence and show the reasoning for those decisions. Memos and minutes, though, should be short and clear and precise. The other thing is, while looking at reporting lines, so senior managers, it's important that senior managers assist the control functions, and that to ensure that the documentation sitting behind their roles and responsibilities, or organisation charts, and that more broadly are kept up to date. Obviously, this is a regime that will see a lot of change in terms of the roles and responsibilities and that. So it's important to make sure that there's sort of regular review of monitoring. Now, unlike the other regimes, you're lucky in Singapore that you don't have to actually submit accountability maps or organisation charts and that to MAS, but of course, during the supervisory process, all of those documents will be important, and it will be important that they are kept up to date. Handover, of course, is a focus of the regime, and so maintaining records to facilitate the handover of a senior manager role and ensure sort of the smooth transition. And that, so what you really want to make sure is that the incoming senior manager would have all the information that they would need to know in order to effectively perform the responsibilities in relation to the relevant core management function. So in the UK, this is quite prescriptive requirements around handover. Delegation of responsibilities, of course, senior managers, will delegate their responsibilities, and that is appropriate. But it's important to understand, of course, that they, continue to be responsible. So, ensuring that that delegation is clearly documented, as I mentioned earlier. Ensuring that you're delegating to persons who have, the right capabilities and are supported in order to be able to carry out those delegated responsibilities. The last couple of things on the slides there, senior managers should ensure that systems and controls and their core management function are appropriately documented, clear to follow, and facilitate compliance by staff. And enhancements, so where reviews of systems and procedures lead to recommendations of enhancements of those systems and procedures, it's important to have written action plans for the implementation of those recommendations. And last but not least, training and communication plans. So ensuring that there are written training plans in place for core management functions. These can cover both sort of role-related training, but also training on regulatory requirements and training on internal policies. So while there aren't, sort of specific regulatory submissions, documentation is still important. So with that, I'd like to thank Sandra for assisting me with the presentation. We're going to move now to the panel session. So if I can ask the panelists now to join me by turning on their cameras, and we'll do some introductions. Great, I think we have, maybe just waiting for Fuiju. So joining me on the panel today, I'm delighted to have some distinguished guests. So we have Ms. Wei-Ling Fua from MAS, who is an Executive Director, Markets Policy and Infrastructure Department. We've got Ms. Fan Tay from, who's the Head of Compliance at JP Morgan Asset Management. Ms. Huiju Hu is the Managing Director, Head of Compliance, APAC, Barclays Bank. Mr. Chun Leong Chia, Executive Director, Group Legal Compliance and Secretariat at DBS Bank. So with that, I will change my slides. Have I, sorry, can I just check that I've stopped sharing my screen now and everyone can see the panelists? Oh, fantastic, yes, great. Okay, wonderful. Look, I mean, let's just start off by sort of taking a step back and having a look at, I guess, the sort of the issuance of the guidelines and the drafting. So, Wei-Ling, what were some of the key drivers behind the issuance of the guidelines? And we've seen that other jurisdictions have introduced accountability regimes which are quite prescriptive, such as the UK or even Australia's BEAR regime. How did MAS go about establishing a regime that was appropriate and relevant for financial institutions in Singapore?
Well, thank you, Natalie, for the question. And let me first begin by thanking both yourself and Sandra for the excellent presentation, and IBF for inviting MAS to the panel discussion today. So Natalie, you have asked what were the drivers for issuing the individual accountability and conduct guidelines. Let me first start by explaining what's happening globally before I zoom in into to taking on a more local lens. So globally, we have seen misconduct and egregious risk-taking in the financial industry. I'll just name a couple of examples. So in the UK, the payment protection insurance mis-selling scandal saw more than 13 million complaints made against retail banks. In Australia, the regulators had also detailed a litany of wrongdoing in the banking industry. This includes forging loan documents and pushing bad investments to customers to meet bonus targets. So one of the root causes of such behavior is really poor conduct and poor culture. So this has prompted regulators globally to increase their focus on financial institutions' culture and conduct standards. establishing accountability on individuals is seen as a key ingredient to promoting a culture of ethical behavior and responsible risk-taking. So from around 2016, jurisdictions such as the UK, Hong Kong, and Australia started introducing accountability regimes. In 2018, the Financial Stability Board also published a toolkit, and within that toolkit included measures to strengthen individual accountability. Now in Singapore, financial institutions are thankfully generally well regarded, but we also have our share of misconduct issues. This includes the mis-selling of mini bonds and other structured products, the manipulation of financial benchmarks by traders, and the laundering of 1MDB related funds through our banking system. These are unacceptable. So clearly there is a need to improve. So in terms of regulatory intervention, we are not starting from ground zero in Singapore. MAS's existing legislation already addresses a number of elements of individual accountability. So for instance, under our corporate governance regulations, key appointment holders such as the CEO, the CFO, the Chief Risk Officer have to be approved by the MAS before they can commence their roles in financial institutions. So the intent of issuing this latest set of guidelines, the Individual Accountability and Conduct Guidelines, is really to supplement the existing regulatory framework. So Natalie, you have observed that some of the accountability regimes in other jurisdictions are more prescriptive. Broadly, those other regimes in the UK, Australia, and Hong Kong require financial institutions to submit more documents to the regulators. This includes the list of senior managers for approval. Statements setting up responsibilities of each senior managers also have to be submitted to the regulators. In contrast, our guidelines on individual accountability and conduct provides a framework, but we do not require these additional documents to be submitted to the MAS. Instead, what we expect to do is to engage the financial institutions as part of our ongoing supervision on the effectiveness of their implementation. So broadly, I would say for MAS, we decided that an outcomes-based approach would be more appropriate. And this is really because our guidelines apply to a very wide spectrum of financial institutions, from the very large global banks to firms with just about 10 employees or so. So in our view, we need to provide flexibility to financial institutions to determine what's the most appropriate way for them to achieve the desired outcomes. But to be helpful to the industry, what we have done is to give clarity on what are the outcomes we want to be achieved. We've also given specific guidance on each of the outcomes in our guidelines. We also issued a set of very detailed FAQs, as well as an information paper on good practices that we've observed in the industry to help financial institutions achieve these outcomes. So ultimately, what we want financial institutions to do is really to apply their minds in strengthening individual accountability instead of adopting a checkbox mentality to check off a list of measures that they have to do. So I hope this has provided a kind of useful background on what triggered the issuance of the IAC guidelines, as well as why MAS decided to adopt an outcomes-based approach.
Thanks, Wei Ling. Look, I think there won't be too many financial institutions that would be saying, gee, I wish MAS had made us submit some regulatory documents, and that it is a bit of an administrative headache in order to continue to keep those up to date. But of course, it's important to keep your internal records up to date. So some work still to be done there. Just moving on to then thinking about how our panelists have gone about implementing the IAC guidelines. So maybe Huiju, we can start with you. Is the implementation being led by a specific function or a broader team? And how are you approaching it generally, sort of from a project basis?
Sure. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Wei Ling, for setting such a useful background and context for the Singapore implementation. So for just a brief introduction about myself, I'm Huiju. I head up the compliance function in APAC for Barclays Bank. So as Wei Ling mentioned earlier, the UK was one of the earlier regulators in setting up this regime. So for us, what was very important when we look at the Singapore implementation is we wanted to make it clear that at the outset that this is not a compliance function's responsibility. So the way we started doing it is we then discussed with the country manager, the CEO of Singapore branch, and then we had him sponsor this program and set up a cross-functional work group to implement the IAC requirements. So mainly the group was run by the country managers with support from the program managers, including various disciplines like compliance, legal, HR, We also have first line representatives on the steering group so that we get early buy-in. And of course, we have internal audit as well, just to give us some independent check and challenge on how we're approaching this subject on a holistic basis. What was extremely important was also the regular meetings that we had in the identification of the senior managers and the MRP. We went department by department. We went by country versus a regional setup. And because in Singapore, we have a subsidiary company as well as a branch presence. So we have to look at two entities as well. And there's a lot of briefings and roles and responsibilities, consultations. And within that group, we were able to thresh out what are the differences in views with regards to any lack of clarity in roles and responsibilities. We then went on to address framework. So the governance framework, we met each of the senior managers identified with how are they supported to do their job? How are they supported to exercise their oversight? So with several existing governance committee meetings, we then mapped them to the senior managers and making sure that all these are documented. We then look at fit and proper criteria, screening. We also try and challenge ourselves about our existing framework, whether they are sufficient to meet the 5 outcomes described by Wheeling earlier. And overall, it's also at this point thinking about how do we make this more sustainable? So I think in a lot of banks, especially probably foreign banks with smaller setup here, it's quite easy to get excited over program implementation and spend less time thinking about making this more sustainable on a permanent basis. So
yeah, I think that's, sorry, I was going to say, I think that's really important, that, embedding that in for the future. Maybe we can save that for a little bit later, because I'd like to drill down into how we move from a project sort of based thing to BAU, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. I think Natalie, just one last point to add.
Of course, yeah.
In the program, there are, of course, people were initially very confused and they were not active in contribution and in refining the framework. So we also had separate sessions with the country managers to provide feedback from a compliance perspective, so that he can then have separate conversation with these individuals that were scoped in for this program. So I think overall, the continuous feedback to the country manager, getting the first line to own this program implementation, and having that cross-disciplinary functions all involved in this rollout is extremely important for us.
Yeah, look, I think that communication is so important, and getting the sort of the buy-in, because it's also not just senior managers, it's MRPs, and then of course looking to sort of embed the regime more broadly for all employees in relation to conduct. So that's great. It sounds like you've been really busy. Fan, what about you? How is JP Morgan Asset Management sort of approach this? Do you also have a sort of a project team leading on it, a cross practice sort of or cross department group?
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. Hi, everyone. I'm Fente from JP Morgan. I'm heading up the asset management compliance. And thanks for IBF as well as this particular session for giving the opportunity for me to share some of the experiences that we have. I think similar to Barclays at JP Morgan, we've done quite a bit of things. I think in the first thing, it's really important for us to conduct several rounds of initial assessment, walk through with a couple of stakeholders for us to together determine how the requirements will impact us, which form, which extent. We assembled a broad-based project team as well that comprises of various work stream, various business unit, not just on the front office perspective, but also the control partners, and more importantly, HR, together with compliance and risk, for us to actually advise on a regular basis in terms of the impact analysis, and also to guide them, to handhold them together. I think communication is definitely very important, because we do see stakeholders who are very particularly concerned around what does it mean for them from an individual accountability perspective. So what we have done is really to share with them, first and foremost, is to raise the awareness of what MAS is expecting from us, from an IAC requirement. And number two is to share with them the progress of the firm's implementation framework, because every firm framework will be very different. So to give them some comfort around how we are implementing What does it mean for them in a particular step? And what does it mean for us when we go live? To also address any questions from the individuals around their statements of responsibility.
I think Fan might have just frozen there.
Responsibilities is really aligned to the IAC guidelines, and whether there's sufficient clarity and granular details. Do I need to do anything on my reporting lines? Does it mean that I need to change my reporting line to the CEO and things like that? One thing that I want to mention is, of course, that what we have done is really to have a slightly earlier than 10 September 2021 go live date, so that we are able to test out the processes and framework, to think about how we can fine tune along the way, because we are worried that, you know, if you go to the end stage, right, probably it will not be a good thing. So I think having an earlier adoption would be very important.
That's great. Thanks, Fan. And yeah, I think definitely giving yourself a bit of a buffer to see how things, you know, operate in practice. No doubt during this whole process, you might have already identified a person as a senior manager and already had, you know, people sort of shuffling roles. So it's really good to be able to actually put, you know, your implementation into practice. Chun Leung, I understand that DBS is sort of implementing this, you know, very much with a focus on data and your role in that as well. Can you provide us with some insights into your approach?
Sure, Natalie. So just an introduction on myself. So I run the data-driven operating model for the legal and compliance team in DBS Bank. And under this role, the oversight of the conduct agenda group-wide is also part of this role, largely because for DBS, we rely primarily on the use of a culture and conduct dashboard for the oversight of our staff conduct. So I saw at the earlier part of the presentations, there was very fruitful discussions around outcome 1 to 3 about how we can go about promoting accountability for the senior managers. And then we also move on to cover how to strengthen oversight on the material risk personnel for outcome 4. So I'd just like to share a little bit on how different FIs can also think about promoting proper conduct under outcome 5 for all employees. So as outcome 5 covers all employees and it takes an outcome-based framework, we do expect different financial institutions to take a different approach in fostering or reinforce the standards of conduct, either through trainings or policies and procedures. And once all these are implemented, there's always this question: how do we know what we are doing are effective? And one of the commonly used tools in the industry will be the use of a culture and conduct dashboard to help us gauge the risk of culture and conduct and see whether is there any actions that needs to be taken, or is there some sense of a comfort that staff behavior and cultures are running well across the institutions. So it's a bit timely for us to also raise this topic, because the ABS Culture and Conduct Steering Committee has also in June issued the industry practice notes on how different financial institutions can consider using culture and conduct dashboards to monitor culture and conduct in their institutions. And this industry practice notes cover recommendation from 2 areas, which is the principles on designing a balanced dashboard, as well as recommendations around various indicators for complete coverage. I would just say 1 or 2 points around some of the better recommendations that I think are coming up from the industry practice notes. Number 1 is on having a balanced dashboards that covers both leading and lagging indicators. So it is easy for institutions to start with looking at the number of misconducts that the staff are going through. So it's always about looking after the negative. So by being more balanced, I think it's also looking at positive behaviors, leading indicators, to see whether is there anything that is probably brewing that will require preemptive actions. Is there anything that, aside from looking at whether staff are misbehaving themselves, is there anything to celebrate as well, so that we can be more balanced, be more forward-looking in the monitoring framework?
Yeah, look, I think it's so important to highlight good behavior, because it's so easy to sort of get dragged down into sort of, you know, lessons learned that focus on when things went wrong. That if we're not recognizing, you know, good behavior and that as well, then people don't know sort of, you know, what to aspire to, or to at least you know, what the expectations are. So really important there. Fuiju, I mean, you're obviously part of a global organization. I think as everyone on the panel has an international you know, footprint in that. But you mentioned you know, being able to look to what some of the other offices and that have you know, been doing and implementing these senior manager accountability regimes. Did you find that particularly useful, or did you really have to sort of come up with something quite different for Singapore? Was there any, you know, challenges around alignment and between the regimes?
Yes, I think the answer depends on which areas we are looking at. So largely because there was already a global framework that was set up since 2016, we did find that very helpful. And the senior management buy-in was a lot easier. And contrary to our initial belief, you know, people who were already senior managers in other regimes, when you ask them to be in scope for the Singapore senior managers regime, there were a lot of there was stronger buy-in, actually less pushback and objection. Of course, locally with the local management team, because you know, we have been operating on more the you know, consensus and a committee kind of a structure, pushing for individual accountability needs a lot of time. I think that was where we spent part of the time talking to people about, you know, what it meant for them as a senior manager under the IAC. So the other aspect that we were able to leverage on are things like exactly what Chun Leong mentioned about getting a balanced conduct and culture dashboard, and also recognizing that you know, it's not just the negative behaviors that we should be focusing on, but the positive as well. So we even you know, leverage on the UK framework, and we changed the name from Bridge Management Framework to Bridge Management and Reward Framework. Yeah. Just to make it more balanced. The other bit is like existing framework on holding individual accountability again under the UK regime. In audit reports, they were issued to also the identified senior managers under the UK regime, and we intend to do that for the Singapore IAC as well. The role of compliance, that was also something that we leveraged on a lot on the UK and the Hong Kong framework in terms of the role we play for remuneration, the review, the role we play for interviewing, say, senior hires in the business, director and MD hires. We had a say, or we had the chance to give feedback on like anyone who has been put up for promotion at director and MD levels. So those are largely what is already existing in the global framework. I think the local nuances go down to, say, the identification of MRPs under the IAC versus, say, the UK regime, where you have material risk takers, MRTs. And we do use different limbs of consideration under the local regulatory consideration versus the UK one. And of course, in terms of size and scale, UK is a lot more complex. So we have to really recalibrate and deliberate what is relevant for local. The other bit is driving the culture about first line accountability. That is also an initial harder sell for us to the local team, but because of the global framework and because of the continuous discussions and reviews, we've now gotten most people on board, so which is largely helpful. We were able to leverage on training materials, statement of responsibilities templates, although we had the fortune of not having to submit that for the MES approval here, but those templates were largely helpful in getting our thought process around how we can support the senior managers and the identified MRPs in discharging and evidencing their oversight and responsibilities.
Yeah. And Fan, I understand JP Morgan Asset Management is a subsidiary incorporated in Singapore. So, but did you still have to sort of plug into that, you know, broader JP Morgan implementation of these other regimes, or did you tend to sort of to build something that was specific to your organization here?
Yeah, sure, Nat. I think thankfully, I don't have to start with a blank sheet. I'm able to leverage off a lot of work that our asset management legal entities in the group and the region has adopted, given that there are similarities with the business model, with the program and the culture, etc. And also at the location perspective, it's really important, like you mentioned, we are part of a subsidiary in Singapore, and Singapore has got many Singapore legal entities. It's very important that we as a group has been adopting a very consistent approach and a thinking and a framework. and more importantly, the reporting structure. So while we may have reporting mechanism in place for the functional reporting, it's also very important for us to keep the local management team posted, given the local governance and oversight that they may have from a Singapore perspective. So we do have many different reports. So I think what is useful is that we have learned that one report can be cut and diced in different ways to be shared in various forums and different committees. So this is very important for us as well from a reporting and metrics perspective. So I think thankfully so far so good, has been quite smooth in terms of the implementation processes. And what Wichu has shared earlier from a marketplace experience point of view, we also see that coming. I think having to the challenge about mapping the right MRP is also quite challenging for us at the initial outset. But I think so far so good, given that we also have quite a very good supportive MES approach in the start while we continue to smooth and fine-tune the IAC guidelines when the implementation go live in September.
Yeah, look, I mean, from experience and seeing these regimes roll out in other jurisdictions and that, there is still more learning to be done after, that go live date. And that I think, once, no doubt, once MAS gets in there and sort of sees how all the, financial institutions have implemented it and interpreted the guidelines, but while they're not prescriptive and instead of principles based, there will probably need to be a bit of calibration, no doubt, for some FIs who may have taken a sort of a more nuanced approach than others. So and I mean, Chun Leong, did you find then that, sort of bringing it back to sort of a Singapore regime, that you ended up sort of building on what you had done in those other jurisdictions where you'd had to sort of comply with the local regimes and build out something that's now more, being led from the front from Singapore?
Right. For DBS Bank, we do have global footprints, especially in UK, Australia, and Hong Kong, where these countries have already implemented the respective accountability regime in advance of Singapore. However, the difference for DBS is that these overseas branches are of smaller in scale, and where else we drive a lot of policies and framework out of the group in Singapore. So as we started out with the IAC implementation, it is good that we do have colleagues in UK, Australia, and Hong Kong to share their experiences with us. But to some extent, after absorbing these learnings, we still have to start from a fresh pitch for Singapore locally incorporated banks. One of the key challenge that we faced will be defining the criteria for the material risk personnel. It's relatively easier to define the criteria for senior managers because we can refer to the definitions of the core management functions and get some guidance. And it's quite easy to identify the senior managers. But when it comes to identify the material risk personnel, then the permutations become very varied. And then as a big organizations with 20 over thousands employees, we also wanted to come up with a framework for the identification of material risk personnel that is simple and sustainable, instead of going row by row and then asking ourselves, is this an MRP or is this not an MRP? So we try to use reasonable proxies, for example, corporate ranks, remunerations, to help us identify different persons who could be in a certain position to take material risk decision, both from the financial and non-financial risk perspective. And then we came up with various criteria. And after that's done, we also try to back test it and see did we miss out anything. For example, with certain criteria that we set out, we run a list of the MRPs that are under this criteria, and then we run it across, say, all the market desk heads who have huge trading limits. We run it across the names of all the credit approvers, and would this criteria similarly catch this role? And then if the answer is yes, then we have very strong comfort that our criteria is correct.
Yeah, no, I think you definitely have to test it in practice, don't you? And I think it goes back to the point Huiju made earlier, and I think it was just around having a bit of a buffer as well before that go live date. I mean, speaking of challenges, Fan, what was some of the challenges that you and the team sort of came across in implementing the IEC guidelines, and how did you overcome them? I think Fan might be having a couple of technical difficulties there. So maybe if we do, if we jump to you with the same question.
I think Fan seems to be back.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry,
hi Fan.
I have a break in between. I do not know which one I have missed. If you don't mind repeating, Natalie.
No problem at all. Sorry, you were just frozen there for a second. So I was just asking, in terms of, were there any particular challenges that arose in implementing the IEC guidelines, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, sure. I think in terms of challenges, I wouldn't say challenges, but I think that a lot of effort and time spent on obtaining buy-in and cooperation from the senior management, which to us, we feel that this is really important, particularly with such a big project and prior to implementation program. We just want to make sure that other senior managers and the material risk personnel, when we talk to them, it will be easier for them to follow, given that there is a top-down approach. From implementation standpoint perspective, it will be very easy. So what we have learned is that the early and proactive engagement is very important, and we will get the support from the top to set the tone right, and that's really critical, and that would help us to ensure adherence to the proposed improved standards that we are looking to implement, and that will flow through quite naturally throughout the whole organization. Obviously, I think HR partners, not forgetting them, is also important for us, because we recognize that early involvement and collaboration with our HR partners is very important, given that our conduct framework needs to be aligned with the HR processes over the life cycle of the employees. And then, like I said earlier, we have also buffered in enough time to build into the process, to test our system, to test our controls, to have the possibility to do some stress tests on the processes, and in particular to see whether if there are some past scenarios that repeat themselves, how are we going to manage that, what are the arrangements that we need to fine tune along the way. Not forgetting, of course, we find that the important aspects of the guidelines is all about training. So training and training and training. So there's no one size fits all model. So what we have done is that we have trained to the extent we can on all the senior managers, material risk personnel, as well as all the employees about the awareness of this particular IEC regime, and also to make cater for their needs, and also looking into the roles and responsibilities questions that may have around IEC guidelines. So I think by and large, we find that, and we are very thankful for MES giving us the transitional period that is long enough for us to go through this process, because with any project, right, we want to make sure that we have enough time to prepare, and also to make sure that when we implement, it is a good program.
Thanks, Fan. And apologies, I think I was attributing the buffer comment in that to Huiju, but of course, yes, it was, you mentioned making sure that you have enough time to put things into practice. I'm sure Barclays are doing the same as well. Huiju, any challenges or as Fan quite rightly put it, effort areas that required a bit more work and a bit more thought from your perspective in implementing the IEC guidelines?
I think three other aspects other than what Fan has touched on, the complex organization structures, especially in a global FI like ours. So there are differences in views between the local and the regional roles. There's matrix reporting that we need to consider. We have key personnel holding like dual designations or multiple teams under their charge in various jurisdictions, as well as if you look at the global markets business, multiple desks under their responsibilities. There's also cut across like different legal entities. So the other aspect really is going down to like supervision structure. So who's responsible supervising the trader on the desk, on the trading floor? Is it the local supervisor or his boss in London or in Hong Kong, for example, given that there's overlapping individual accountability regime. I think with the global market business is also booking versus distribution. So one leg of the transaction may touch Singapore, but not the full transaction. So how do we split that accountability among the senior managers? The other aspect is outsourced functions. So a lot of banks will have this issue as well, which is if you outsource a function to another legal entity or in another part of the world, how is the senior manager sitting in Singapore feeling that he's accountable and feeling that he has complete control oversight on? So that is another aspect that we spend quite a lot of time with the senior managers sitting down and mapping various governance committee meetings, MIs, and bilateral sessions with the service companies that we outsource the functions to make sure that they have this complete comfort. The third bit I will mention is subcultures. So senior managers and generally maybe the material risk personnel gets it, but what about the people below them? Because when the senior managers now know that they have personal accountabilities, how do they make sure that the tone from the middle say the same thing? How do they make sure that people under them are comfortable enough to escalate incidents in a timely and appropriate manner? And if the senior managers themselves are concerned, right, where do they go to? Where's the next escalation forum? So these are some of the challenges that we face when we talk about like just cultural norms, behaviors, and buy-in. So there's a lot of time invested in these three areas that I just described.
Yeah, thanks, Huiju. I mean, I think a few of you touched on one thing that we've seen a lot of, FIs grappling with, where you've got, I guess, sort of a global footprint, and but where you might actually have, say, for example, a country head in, in Singapore for a function, and then also the regional head sitting here as well. I mean, Wei-Ling, perhaps it would be good to get your thoughts on some of the factors that the financial institution should be taking into consideration of determining, is it the regional head who's probably the most senior person, but maybe not involved in the day-to-day management? Who really should be the senior manager in that situation?
So really the key principle is to identify who has the responsibility for running the financial institution's day-to-day operations in Singapore. So if the regional head is directly responsible for running the day-to-day operations in Singapore, then that regional head should be designated the senior manager, regardless of the location he or she is at. On the other hand, if the responsibility for managing the FI's affairs in Singapore is assigned to the country head, then the country head should be designated the senior manager. So in another scenario, if this responsibility is shared between both the regional and country head, then both persons need to be identified as the senior manager. But the division of responsibilities between these two individuals should be very clearly defined.
Great, thanks for that. I'm sure that the audience will find that really helpful. Perhaps if I can ask you sort of another question as well, and I guess it sort of touches on something that Chun Leong mentioned, is just in relation to some of the challenges, I guess, around appointing or identifying MRPs. So if you've got, does someone who is more senior than a senior manager need to be appointed as an MRP?
Okay, so maybe some clarity around definitions. So a senior manager is actually the most senior individual for a core function in the FI's operations in Singapore. So you should not have a case where a senior manager reports to an MRP. So I'll give an example. So in a situation where, say, an individual A supervises a group of MRPs, and this individual A reports to a manager B, A is actually an MRP while B is the senior manager. So under our guidelines, we've clarified that direct supervisors or MRPs are automatically considered MRPs unless they are themselves designated as senior managers.
Thanks. Again, that's a helpful clarity on that point. So, I mean, another role that has, I think, sort of, caused a lot of discussion is that of the Chief Data Officer. So, Chun Leong, you mentioned, data is very much a sort of a focus and part of this regime. And that has DBS appointed a Chief Data Officer as a CMF?
Yep. So as we call ourselves a digital bank, one of the things that we did when we set up this strategy is to appoint a Chief Data Officer. Having said that, when it comes to implementing the IAC guidelines, we also ask ourselves for the various C-suite roles. Do they fall under the criteria of a senior manager, or do they fall under the criteria of the material risk personnel? So it all depends on the role of the chief data officer in that organization. I think based on my experience, I've seen some organizations putting the chief data officer involved in more innovation roles as opposed to governance roles. And the other question to ask would be that who are the chief data officer working with together to drive governance, to drive policies on privacy, securities, etc. And are these people already designated as senior managers and take the accountability for these key risk areas? So as back to the point about IAC being an outcome-based framework, I think it's not just about looking at the words of the requirements. If you see a role, chief data officer, inside the list of the CMF in the annex of the guidelines, it does not necessarily mean that this person must be a SM, but I think it's about assessing for ourselves what is this role functioning, what is this role doing. And conversely, if a certain role is taking on a very senior role and that's not listed in the list of CMF, but the organization thinks that actually this person qualifies or warrants to be designated as a senior manager, for example, here legal, then again, this organization should take the liberty or take the discretion to do what is right for the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Fan, what about your organization? Has JPM Asset Management appointed a chief data officer?
Yeah, we currently do not have a chief data officer for the purpose of IAC guideline itself. And this role is embedded within the relevant unit of the business function. For example, this is the customer data, it will reside within the business itself. Technology also have certain responsibility from the data governance and technology control perspective. So we do not have a particular chief data officer per se, but it is part of the senior manager roles and responsibilities in respect of the various respective business data, so to speak.
Yeah. So instead of appointing sort of one person, you've built it into the roles and responsibilities.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Huiju, what about at Barclays? How have you approached it?
Similar to Fan, yeah, similar to JP Morgan.
Yeah, yeah. And Wheeling, that's right, isn't it? If you don't have a person who is, you know, I guess if you don't have a role such as the chief data officer, you don't necessarily need to make up that, you know, that role.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. So this is really a decision for the financial institutions to make. Maybe just to give a bit of background on why we had included the role of Chief Data Officer in our list of core management functions. It's really to underscore the importance of management oversight in ensuring the responsible and ethical use of data. This is in view of increasing adoption of data analytics and artificial intelligence in various aspects of financial institutions and business. But more generally, I do want to clarify that the list of core management functions that were provided in the guidelines, those are just meant to provide guidance. They're neither meant to be exhaustive nor prescriptive.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple of questions there to answer in that, but before we do, I just want to touch on, I think that the point that you know, Huiju mentioned earlier about sort of moving from a project mindset to you know, sort of to BAU. And I mean, as I see it as well, you know, people's roles change or people, you know, move on to other roles and that. So, you know, how can an FI ensure that the implementation on day one sort of remains relevant and compliant? So, Huiju, maybe if I can put that back to you.
Sure, thank you, Natalie. I think first of all is the wide recognition that we cannot be dependent on the role holder to make this BAU transition. We have to be dependent on the governance and the framework that is established under the program to make this work on a permanent basis. I think the other bit is really looking through the life stages of a senior manager when you're becoming one, when you're operating as one, and when you're living as one. right? What are the accompanying procedures and controls that you have, and make sure that all these are properly documented in, say, in Barclays, we call it the Senior Manager's Handbook. So it touches on all life cycles of a senior manager, and we use that to brief the senior managers and make sure that we have one-on-one sessions with them to make sure they understand what does this entail. The other bit is still going back to the point on culture and conduct, that the tone from the top and the tone from the middle, they recognize that compliance with the IAC is not the compliance function's responsibility, but rather is the whole bank's responsibility. And more importantly, the business representatives, there must be sufficient level of buy-in and conviction in making that happen, and making that that whole group collectively personable accountabilities is important. So whoever that is not abiding by the framework, there should be some form of consequence management so that we drive the right culture and behavior. The last rule I will offer is clarity. Make sure that everyone is very clear what they are in it for, what are their liabilities, how are they supported to discharge, and demonstrate that they have exercised due care in their roles. Simplicity, where it involves more than one senior managers and accountability regimes, right? Do we try to replicate that, or we try to simplify that? I think in Barclays, we very much try to simplify that. So we may have a manager that's accountable under the Hong Kong regime as well as Singapore regime. And because it's different business, right, from a geographical coverage perspective, we also want to make sure that the senior managers themselves are very clear. Although the framework may be consistent, there may be some local nuances in terms of regulatory requirements. So that is also covered by the respective teams in the jurisdiction. I think the other bit is seniority. So making sure that when you appoint a senior manager or MRP, they come with sufficient years of experience, so that they are very thoughtful in the thinking about their roles and how they support others in making sure that collectively as a group, as a Singapore management team, right, they can support each other and meet the requirements. The authority, making sure that people that you appoint as senior manager for Singapore, they hold true accountability and authority to make executive decisions. And if there's any doubt, there's an escalation forum to the Asia Pacific Executive Committee. That's where we will review all these concerns, and we then take a collective decision on how to support the Singapore team on some of these concerns and challenges. I think the last thing is ability, right? Be very careful about who you hire as a senior manager. Make sure that we do all the due checks, the screening. To MES earlier point is about fit and proper. So making sure that it's not a one-off screening, one-off dialogue, and that there will be continuous screening and dialogue throughout the year, and on a permanent basis rather than a program basis.
Yeah, all really helpful tips. I think Chun Leung, you mentioned using toolkits. I mean, or using in particular the sort of the dashboard and that for measuring culture and conduct more broadly. It's certainly the Financial Stability Board and its toolkit on mitigating strengthening governance and to mitigate misconduct also was very much sort of focused on the indicators. And that is there anything else that you're doing as well, sort of around I guess embedding the IAC guidelines for the future?
Yep. So we see this as a continuous journey. We don't see 10th of September as the day we cross the finishing line. Actually, it just started. Everything just started. Everything will start on the 10th of September. And then we have to start measuring whether the policies, the framework, the approaches that we have that we have done to get ourselves ready for the IAC implementations remain effective. And to that end, our culture and conduct dashboard is also going through reviews just to make sure that the indicators continue to stay sensitive to the outcomes that we want to measure. And at the same time, it's not, as a locally incorporated bank, we are not just focusing on implementing IAC and culture and conduct in Singapore. And there are a lot of conversations going around with our overseas branches and core locations to harmonize the way we measure culture and conduct, making sure that we use consistent standards And particularly for the use of the culture and conduct dashboards, the thresholds and the triggers are also set in a consistent manner, so that what is blinking in the group is also consistently being used at the country level. Yep. So these are the few things that we are seeing as a long-term, iterative way of fostering culture and conduct. So we don't see 10th of September as the day to celebrate.
Yeah, it all starts then. Great. Look, we've got a couple of questions just to take maybe in the last 5 minutes in that. So one of the attendees has asked, which department leads in determining the MRP criteria? HR, compliance, risk management, for example, or is it the case actually that it's been sort of a cross-discipline exercise for the project team more broadly, and or maybe in the future it would reside with one department just to continue to ensure that that criteria remains relevant? Does anyone want to volunteer to take that question?
I can maybe kick off, Natalie. So for Barclays, it's all 3 departments involved. So compliance, we will advise on, what are the regulatory expectations. The risk function, they use certain risk criteria under the MRT LIMS in the UK. So things like risk and governance framework. So that is the risk department. HR is mainly involved because under the UK MRT LIMS, there's also a remuneration aspect to be considered for senior managers. So for us, it's all 3 functions. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. That's really helpful. There's a question on any tips on getting subcultures, so persons below MRPs, to be accountable. I think to clarify, the IAC guidelines, the accountability sort of sits with senior managers, but obviously at the sort of the broader employee level, in that, the idea is that we will be making sure that the standards of conduct that we expect of those employees is clearly communicated and enforced. So any tips on how to, I guess, persons below MRPs to sort of comply with those expected standards of conduct? Any takers?
So again, I think this came from my sharing. For us, I think the subcultures got to be addressed at the supervisor level. So although the IAC do not go down to the level below the senior manager and the IAC, but because the senior managers, they are responsible for the delegation of responsibilities. So they got to make sure that the supervisory structure and framework is strong and they can maintain evidence. So for us, we leverage a lot on technology. So all the supervisory reviews that the supervisor does on his desk, on his team, especially for the licensed and markets activities, these are all registered in our system to evidence reviews done, when it was done, and what kind of outcomes or observations the supervisor makes. I think the other bit that's important is if a supervisor finds that there are exceptions noted, there is also follow up on what are the actions or taken following those exceptions noted on the tone in the middle. So yeah. I think also is an important part of driving individual accountability at a lower level.
Yeah. That's really helpful. And just one last question. So one of the attendees has asked if we can share, the panel can share how they recommend documenting the senior manager responsibilities. So how have you gone about doing that? Did you obtain sort of an email acknowledgement? Did you have an addendum to the contract, or updates to job descriptions? Maybe Fan, how did you approach that at JPM?
Yeah, I think the statement of responsibilities is one of the things that we try to leverage off a lot of the good works that have done by our regional and global counterparties in the global offices. So we have actually established quite a comprehensive statement of responsibility. Responsibilities are pretty high level. So what we have also done is to come up with like a dashboard to explain how each and every roles and responsibilities are mapped More importantly, we have a opportunity from compliance to also take a look at that more high level to provide the advice and guidance. So what we do is that we look at whether or not there are granular clarity, there is a particular accountability. How do you ensure that the reporting that was being furnished are reported in the various committee? How does the committee, and more importantly, the board and senior managers able to supervise and oversee the business operations? So this is one of the things that we looked into. So this is more something that we have done, and I think more on a periodic basis. We also will undergo some periodic attestation. So what we do is that we send compliance reminder to the senior managers and MRP to remind them that should there are changes of the roles or responsibilities require anything that they are aware of, they should also inform the respective working group to tell us, all this in advance so that we can advise them accordingly. And the periodic attestation that we have gotten from them at least once a year to make sure that the program continue to have their most up-to-date and relevant statement of responsibilities. So these are some of the things that we have done, and happy to share if the participants feel that this is something that they would like to get from the panelists.
That's great, thanks. Look, I mean, that just about brings us to time. So, I mean, a big thank you to our panelists for the really helpful insights and that today and your sharing. Wheeling and the MAS team that have supported this, again, thank you to you as well. It's always great to hear from MAS and that to some of the thinking behind these regimes, and a huge thank you to IBF for arranging today's session. I hope that all the attendees found it useful, and Nicole, I'll hand back to you to wrap up.
All right, thank you, Natalie, Sandra, Chun Leong, Wheeling, Fan, and Seju for the very insightful session and discussion, guys. We've now come to the end of the masterclass. For those who want to check in with your certificate of attendance, to be sent to your registered email within 5 working days. And if you'd like to connect with IBS, you may do so via the following platform. All right. Thank you once again for joining us. Till next time. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.